Hello, and welcome to the Next Great Car Era, a podcast by EVTUNERS. I'm your host, Daniel Martin, and today I'm joined by Geoff Budd, or as many of you might know him from Instagram, Red Goes Green. Geoff is the owner of a red 94 Acura NSX, which he has rebuilt with a Tesla Model S motor, hence the name Red Goes Green. But most importantly, this build adds significant horsepower to one of the most celebrated chassis from the 90s, and due to his battery choices, is still very light and nimble. We dive into details about Geoff's racing background, the history of his NSX, the build specifics and part choices, and what's next for this awesome ride as he dials it in for daily commuting and spirited weekend drives. Hear all that and more right now. Enjoy. Geoff, welcome. Thank you so much for carving out the time today to chat with me.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Dan.
Yeah, my pleasure. Before we dive in, maybe you could do a little bit of an introduction and brief background for folks who might not know who you are.
Sure. My name's Geoff. I am the builder slash owner of Red Goes Green, which is a EV swapped NSX. But before EV swapping and the NSX in general, I have been into Miatas and building kit cars and just amateur racing. So cars have been a thing I've done for quite some time, but only recently jumping into the EV scene.
Very cool. I was thinking about you so not a couple days ago, but the weekend before that, I went to Big Willow for the very first time. I think I told you it was going to happen, and it did pan out. And man, what a good time. It was super fun.
Oh man, that first track day is just so much fun. I feel like there's just so much you can learn that first day, but like trying to absorb it all and oh, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm glad you had a good time. And
I did. I'm looking forward to the next one, but man, I have a lot to learn. The car is so much faster than I am, and but it was really neat seeing everyone else's cars. I mean, there's a ton of people there. I think 3 EVs total, but like it was just cool to see all of the different cars and how they were setting up. And there's lots of people in the HPDE, the high performance driving experiences, but then there was also time trials and even some more like kind of competitive professional level races that were happening. They break it out. I think of it as like a track meet or a swim meet. They break it into different heats, and you go out for 20 minutes and do your thing, and then the next group comes in, and there's really a broad range of folks and skills from like me, who is just learning, to people that were sponsored and company cars and uh, actually doing meaningful races.
I mean, you got to start somewhere. So I don't think it's
Heck yeah.
the meaningful races versus the people who are just starting. It's all great that everyone's out there and having fun. Did you let someone else drive your car with you riding? I feel like that's one of the like really eye-opening experiences. Not just when you're new, like,
Hmm.
you've been driving for a while. It's just having someone else show you like, oh, I'm the one who was holding the car back.
Yeah. No, but that's a good idea. So, I did the like ride along. It worked out really great. A coworker of mine, a friend that I know, I realized, and we kind of discovered like, oh, we're both into cars, and he's an instructor with them. So I was able to like get him to be the one riding along and helping me. 'Cause for HPDE1, you have to have an instructor in the car. So I knew the guy, and we had a background and had hung out before. So that was really cool. But we didn't swap, but maybe next time. That's a good idea.
Yep. I mean, it really shows you like, oh wow, it's it's me.
Yes. Well, I'm pretty certain of that for sure. But it would be interesting to see, because as I'm learning, how much is acceptable slide? How hot do you go into corners? I'm still kind of easing into that, whereas the guys that are really experienced, that's kind of second nature for them. What may feel out of control to me, they're like, oh no, that's totally within margin.
Yep. And once you're more used to the car and the track, you start having more bandwidth to look around and understand, like, okay, where's someone else on the track, or making thinking about more than just the very next turn, but like, okay, what are the next two turns and how do I line up for that? And yeah.
It's so much fun. So, can you actually dive in maybe a little bit more into your past in motorsport and the types of things that you did? Kit cars, Miata. I think you said there was and maybe 24-hour of lemons. There's a couple different things you did.
Sure, yeah. So I had friends who were in the Miatas. I guess that was somewhere in my mid 20s, and in the end, I bought one. I actually bought it with the intent of taking the motor out and putting it in a Triumph Spitfire that I had at the time.
Oh,
But
cool.
yeah, I mean that was the plan. But then I drove the Miata, like, because I bought a running Miata from a friend, and
Yeah.
I was like, this is actually a really fun car. Like, it's gonna be a lot of work to put all this in the Spitfire. And so I ended up selling the Spitfire and just keeping the Miata. That one I put a turbo on.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, Mega Squirt, and started getting into like tuning the car. And then I was going to track days, so HPD events, and doing that. There's a yearly Miata event, so I would go to that down at Laguna Seca.
Mm.
So it's different places now. Um, and
Moves
so
around probably, right?
yeah, well, when Mazda used to sponsor Laguna Seca, and so it
Oh,
was
okay.
Laguna Seca then, and now that they don't sponsor it anymore, it jumps around to different places.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so I did that for a few years, just HPD, having fun with driving the car, building out the turbo on the car, and then I had known about this. There's a kit called an Exoset, which is basically a tube chassis with Miata everything else.
Hmm.
Um, so you take a Miata, you make it not very aerodynamic anymore, but you remove about 1,000 pounds from the car, um, which is
That's
pretty significant.
substantial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I came across a kit that someone had started but hadn't finished, and so I bought it for pretty cheap, and put that together. Got it registered in California, so it's a street legal go kart, basically, like literally tubes and a motor and a seat, and you're just driving around on the street. So I had a lot of fun with that. Uh, in the end, having a go kart on the street, like it was fun, but it like wasn't the most practical thing to drive. And so there's another Miata kit car called the Catfish, which actually isn't in production anymore. And so I found someone selling a body for that, and did a bunch of measurements and thought about it. And the wheelbase for both of these kits is Miata. Like, they didn't change anything about that. And so uh, I drove down to LA, rented a U-Haul, and picked up this expensive fiberglass body and drove it back home and like put it on my tube chassis car and was like, well, it does actually fit. And so I still have that car. So it's no longer, it doesn't look like a go-kart anymore. Now it looks, more like a weird exotic.
Oh,
It's got
cool.
you step into the cabin. There's no doors, like no roof, like uh, so. And I still take that to track days. That's my track car. So, and had fun with that for a while, and then ultimately some friends of mine were like, hey, we want to do lemons, or we want to do lucky dog, we want to go race a real car wheel to wheel. And I was like, you know what, that sounds great.
Yeah.
And so me and some friends, we bought a Integra, and I welded in the roll cage for the car, because you actually have to have like real safety equipment when you're doing wheel to wheel racing. And we built the car up to be safe, and we took it out and we raced Lemons, I think was our first race. And then we started doing Lucky Dog as well. Because, I mean, the car was a little too nice for Lemons, realistically.
Mm.
Lemons has this 24 hours of Lemons. It's supposed to be a cheap car that you put safety equipment in and go race. And part of, and they, encourage themes and silliness, but we had just built an Integra. It wasn't like there was nothing too silly about it. And the only reason it was, cheap enough to really race is because it had been B20 swapped before we bought it, so it couldn't be registered in California, which makes it a perfectly fine race car.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. You kind of lucked out in that regard.
Yes, we did. Though, like, I think it was the night before our second race. I changed the oil on the car and it came out milkshake, and which means the head gasket had gone, and we're like, oh no. And like it's literally the night before, and so no machine shops available, and this, doing some crazy stuff. We got I have a glass coffee table, and we spray adhesive sandpaper to the coffee table, and literally surface the head by sliding it back and forth across sandpaper on a flat surface.
Whoa, that's
It totally works.
creative.
I mean, I had read that this was a thing that you could do, and I was like, well, it's either that we do this or we don't race. It
Yeah.
just kind of like that ethos continued out throughout the just make the car work so we can race. And we actually ran with that surfaced head for many races, and it just totally worked. Which I, I did it. I was like, well, we'll put a couple hours in. It'll either work or it won't. And I was very impressed with the results.
I'm impressed too. That's
Yeah.
awesome. And there you go. There's the character of the car.
Yes.
They
Uh,
wanted that for lemons. Well,
Here's the picture. Here's proof of us doing something real dumb.
yeah.
Yeah, and so since then, I've raced with some other friends in a different Integra. I've gone up to Washington and Oregon and raced with some friends up there who have a BMW E46
Mm.
that they also do. I think the best experience I've had, so like it's the 24 hours of lemons. Very few of the races are actually 24 hours like through the
Oh,
night.
really? Okay.
It's usually like 7 or 8 hours on Saturday and 7 or 8 hours on Sunday, and at night, everything's shut down. But I did get to race the E46 in a true 24-hour race at ORP up in Oregon, and watching the sunrise while you've been racing the car for the past 16 or 17 hours. It's just like it's a crazy thing to be going around the track. And the I did a midnight stint, and having those headlights of the much faster cars just like coming up behind you super fast, and it's like, oh man, I'm barely aware of where the next turn is, and I have to like not get hit too. It's I don't know. I feel like when you're actually racing wheel to wheel, like it's a time when you can really like you have to be completely focused on what you're doing. And
Yeah.
as soon as you find yourself like drifting and thinking about something else, like you're not in the race anymore. You need to like call in and be like, hey, get me out of the car. Someone else needs to be driving this. But like it's a great like just so much focus just driving the car like that. So
I
uh,
think that's one of the really cool things about racing and or driving, performance driving, is that it forces you to be so focused. It's almost meditative because you have to be. And at a time, I mean, we all have so many things going on. It's tough to focus sometimes, but this is a way that everything melts away and you're just thinking, you're just really present. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that feeling, you get out of the car and you're like, "Whoa, that was 2 hours." I mean, that's general 2 hours is the general stint in the Lucky Dog or Lemons is what we're generally doing. Like,
Okay, I was going to ask. That's a long, I mean, I did 20 minutes going around on HPDE and it's like that felt long. So 2 hours is I mean, you must be tired at the end of that.
yeah, I mean, you're physically tired, but you're also like mentally like, okay, I've just been like really focused for 2 hours straight. I need to like
Yeah,
get in the car and like decompress and like uh
drink some water.
yes. Well, fortunately, we have water, like water tubes in the race car. You're in it for
Oh,
long enough.
okay.
You drink water, and we have a cool suits, so like because you get hot, and so that we have ice water pumping through tubes under your race suit.
Sweet. I've seen those. I always thought that they sounded incredibly comfortable.
It's
It's
really
like I
nice.
just want one in the summer to walk around, I think.
Yes, one of my friends who has the E46 up in Oregon, it got or in Washington, it got real hot up there last summer, and he literally sat in his
Yeah.
living room with the cool suit on.
I love that.
Yep.
So racing in your future, more are you kind of taking a break from that or when the friends call came to go?
Yeah, so I don't own like I have the kit car, which is good for track days, but I don't own a actual race car at this point, and so I'm mostly just racing when other friends of mine have cars that are available and want to drive. So I think we're signed up in November, and that's like the next race that I'm actually thinking about doing.
Cool.
Um, so I recently had a kid, and that's like tapered back on like my ability to actually go like race a lot, and but it does mean I'm home more, which means I get to spend, when she goes to bed, I go out to the garage and work on the car. Uh,
Yeah.
um,
So the car, let's start talking about that a little bit. Um, the maybe we can start at the beginning with the history, NSX, how you got into them, and how you found this one, and got the idea of EV swapping it.
sure. I mean, in general, I've wanted to EV swap a car for quite some time, and
Oh, okay.
it didn't make sense for a long time with lead acid and forklift motors, and like I was just like, that's not really what I want to do. And then Teslas and Leafs and all of these like modern EVs built by manufacturers at scale started coming out, and I was like, okay, technology's getting there. And then the NSX itself is just, I mean, it's a gorgeous car that
It
I've wanted
is.
for a long time, and I actually about 3.5 years ago, I tried to buy one. It was offered to me at what is now an amazing deal, and I was like, "Oh, how about we take off like 2 grand?" And the seller was like, "No." And I should have just done it, and I didn't. And I've
Hmm.
taken myself like ever since. That like as I watch the prices just climb up, I'm like, "How did I not just buy that car?" And so, when I was saying like, "Oh, I think I actually want to EV swap a car. Let's go do it." And I was like, "Oh, let's go look at NSXs." And I looked around, and the prices are pretty high.
Hmm.
But ultimately, I found one that had a lot of miles on it, wasn't the cleanest car, and the original motor was already gone. So like it seemed like it lined up well, and because the original motor was already gone and had so many miles, it was cheaper. It was still more expensive than the completely functional car that I could have bought like 3 years ago.
Yeah.
But at some point, I have to say, well, I think this trend is just going to continue, so I might as well hop in now. Like when I can do it, I might as well.
Yes.
And so, interesting thing, like the NSX is mid-engine and it's transverse, so it's kind of like you took a front wheel drivetrain and put it in the back of the
Hmm.
car, and that actually works pretty well with a Tesla drivetrain, because the Tesla drivetrain is effectively a differential and a motor and an inverter all just in one little package. Um, and so if you have like a front engine, if you have a front engine rear wheel drive car, the motor is longitudinal, and that doesn't really work well with like a Tesla motor, because it's meant to be run uh, in the other orientation with
Right.
CV coming out. And so with the NSX, it actually lines up great. It fits really perfectly in the width of the engine bay. There's about 2 inches on either side of the motor. That was a big thing when I was buying
Wow.
that. Is like I asked the seller, like, can you measure like literally between the frame rails? Because if this motor doesn't fit, if it's like 2 inches too wide, what am I going to do? I'm not going to cut up the aluminum chassis of the NSX to try to get this motor in. And so I got super lucky when he sent me the numbers, and I was like, well, that seems like it'll work. I might as well just like I'm going to pull the trigger. And so the car was on the East Coast, and I bought it without having ever seen it in person or measured anything in person, and it just got it rolled off the
Wow.
auto transport, and I was like, well, there it is.
That's amazing. That's great that you got lucky too. I mean, it couldn't have worked out better.
Yep, yep. And, and now there are like people who are like, "Oh man, you ruined an NSX," and I'm like, "No, I didn't. Like this car was already like well on its way to being ruined. I took it and made it a functional, fun car."
Sure. Yeah. There's
Whereas
always people that are like that are purists. Um, I
yeah,
mean, there's folks that like only like classic cars that are restored with like the exact same engine that was in it, and if you do a engine swap, it's a travesty.
it's got to be
This is
numbers matching, man.
right, right. But I guess my take is that what's cooler than any of that is seeing cars on the road still. It's less and less. I mean, it's almost never you see NSXs on the road. A lot of the 90s cars, the tuners cars in California, especially, they're just not on the road that much anymore. And so getting one back on the road is a win in my book.
Absolutely. And I mean that's my goal for the car too, is just to like drive it and have fun with it. I'm not building like I have the kit car that I can go on the track with. I have friends with race cars. I don't need to like build it to be this, crazy thing. I just want to get out there and have fun. And sure, it makes like twice as much power as it did stock. That's fun, but like not like
Yeah.
necessarily a requirement.
Are you gonna maybe take it to drag strip or anything like that? And maybe not wheel to wheel racing, but a little bit autocross, anything?
I have been thinking about it. I will probably go to an autocross. I will definitely go to the drag strip. I've got a friend with LS swapped, C10 that he likes to, take to the track, or sorry, to the drag strip. And
Sure.
so, there's Wednesday night, bring your street car, run whatever you brung kind of races up at Sonoma. And so my plan is to later this summer be up there with the car. There's still a lot of work I got to do. Like I would be uncomfortable taking it down a drag strip right now personally, just from the fit and finish of some of the work on the car. And so it's still very much a work in progress, but I do want to get to the point where I'm comfortable taking it to the drag strip. In reality, like, so I took it to Holly High Voltage last year. I'm still waiting on the dates. I'm hoping to go this year, but my plan is, if it's possible, to actually do like I think it's the Grand Champion thing where you do autocross, drag strip, a lap around the track, and do all of those in the car.
That'd
So
be
I
cool.
want, yeah. Whereas last year I just did car show because like it rolled technically, but didn't actually really drive. And so this year I'm like, oh, I've got like, I've done over 150 miles on the street in the car, so I know that it like mostly works.
Yeah, that definitely counts now.
Yeah.
So can we get into the build a little bit more? You mentioned you're using the Tesla unit. So that's your motor and some gearing going straight out to the axles go in there, right? Same kind of transverse mounting. What about batteries and battery management, cooling, things like that?
Sure. So we'll start with the motor. It's a Tesla large drive unit. I'm running an open inverter control board, which is the open source control board that it's got a million parameters that you can tweak to make it run better or worse, depending on how you do it. I'm using that because the motor needs to spin backwards, so I can't just spoof the signals going to the motor because the Tesla Model S is limited to I think 40 miles an hour in reverse. And I'm actually just running the motor in reverse when I'm driving forward, and 40 would not be good enough.
So
Um,
why is that real quick?
I'm running the motor in reverse because in a Model S, the motor is behind the differential. And so that actually doesn't, with a mid engine car, the motor is in front of the differential generally. And so in order to fit it in the NSX, I had two options. I could spin it, around its vertical axis, but now it has to spin backwards, or I could flip it completely over and run it upside down. But the problem with running it upside down, it still runs forward in that case, which is nice, but the oiling doesn't work. There's actually an oil pump inside the differential to pick up, oil and sling it onto the gears to keep them running. But now the pickup would be on the top, and the vent would be literally just dripping fluid out.
Not
And
good.
so no, and it's not designed to run upside down, and so I flipped it around, and so now it runs in reverse. I got a reverse rotation oil pump. That's just available from Zero EV in the UK. Super convenient. Just bolts in after you spend a lot of time to take the whole motor apart.
Sure. Yes, I bet.
Yeah. So that's in there. That's the motor. It's running backwards. The axles are actually Model S axles. So the width of the Model S is much too wide for the NSX. So I couldn't use the subframe and everything from the NSX. So I had to build my own subframe to hold the motor backwards. And then actually just sent the axles out and had them shortened about 3 inches per side uh, to meet the track width of the NSX. And then I got super lucky that the Model S outer CV joint the splines just slide right into the NSX hubs. They use literally exactly the same diameter.
Wow.
So like aside from the center section of the CV axle, which is just shortened, it's a Model S axle. So I know like I'm very unlikely to break that part of the axle or that part of the drivetrain train because it's used to moving a car that weighs 2,000 pounds more. So it should probably be able to handle whatever I'm throwing at it.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, definitely. How did they shorten those axles? And did you have to find a specialty shop to do that, or go to like drive shaft shop? They do a lot of high performance stuff, right?
I sent them off to a specialty shop up in Idaho.
Okay.
They cut down and respline axles for hot rods all day long, and so they literally just have a form. We can. I don't remember the name of the company, but I can
Yeah,
send
that's
it
fine.
again. But basically, because I wanted the same spline, it was really easy. I just told them like I want this axle 3 inches shorter, same spline. You send them the axle, just the center section, and then the mating part of the CV axle that slides on, so they can test to make sure that they cut it correctly. So you just disassemble it like a regular CV axle until you're down to the shaft. You send them the shaft and the mating part. A few weeks later, you get it back in the mail and reassemble your CV axles.
That's amazing.
Yes, and so the nice part about that is like had the Model S axles or outer joints not fit in the hubs of the NSX, my plan was to have them resplined to match the NSX outer CV joints, and so then I would have Model S inner CV joints, Model S custom center shaft, and then NSX outer CV joints. So that's a way that it's pretty easy to do if you want to if you have a setup a front wheel drive car or a mid-engine car where you can just use the CV axles like that, just measure the outside, have them cut them down to width and send it off. So like I feel like that's a big concern that people have when building EVs is like how am I going to connect this motor to the wheels?
Yeah.
If you're using CV axles, it's not so bad.
Yeah, it sounds like while you got lucky, it's a reasonably straightforward approach to get it resplined if you need to whatever car it's ultimately going into.
Yep, I see a lot of builds where people like cut the axle in the center and like try to weld it together or pin it, and that just doesn't feel secure enough for me to that motor makes a ridiculous amount of torque, and your whole
Yeah.
welds are gonna hold up. It makes much more sense to just build a CV axle as it was made to be built, and not worry about that. Um,
So let's be honest, we like to stomp on the throttle and use that torque too, which is going to be magnify the amount of force that axle has to take. It's not easing into it; it's going all at once.
Oh yeah. I actually I need to rebuild my front motor mount because I did not use a stiff enough tube, and so once I played around with the parameters a bunch and got everything working really well, I went out and I stepped on it pretty hard, and I was like, oh, that was fast.
Yeah.
And I went and actually crawled into the car, and the motor mount tube is now bent. The motor, it tried to lift the car via the tube, and I just didn't make it strong enough. So now I have to go remake it. Probably a thicker tube and a truss to hold it in there. I, I just kind of eyeballed it and said, "That's a pretty thick tube. It'll probably be okay." And then later on, after it bent, I went back and did the math, and I was like, "Oh no, that's just a lot of torque."
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, let's see. What was it? Oh, you asked me about the batteries.
Yeah.
Uh, I, for testing purposes, I originally used two Prius batteries, like early gen Prius, just because they were super cheap. They're $60 for a battery, and for
Wow.
130 bucks, I had a 400 volt. It's only like 1 kilowatt, but that's enough to like prove that the system works. And so I
Yeah.
used that, and like my first drive around the block was with a stack of Tesla batteries, just kind of like loosely held in place. And I was like, well, okay, it drives. But those aren't good enough. And so now I'm using Chrysler Pacifica hybrid batteries. Um,
Okay.
it's actually somewhat I mean, not common per se, but I've seen them used in a number of other builds, and that's actually where I got the idea. Is someone posted like, "Hey, I'm using these modules." Batteries were a concern for me because the Tesla, in order to get 400 volts out of a Tesla pack, you basically have to use all of the modules in the Tesla. They're all in series, and so that's 16, big bricks, and I just don't have the room for that in the NSX. Like it
Right.
kind of looks like a big car, but in reality, it's a really small car. When
Hmm.
if you park it like next to a Camry, you're like, oh, it's kind of about the same length and much lower, and so I had to make this decision. Well, I can't use Tesla batteries. I need high discharge, and I don't need like huge kilowatts because like my kilowatt hours. My plan isn't to
Right.
like go on road trips in this car. I want to commute and drive around. So I just need enough to like I have a 30-mile commute that I occasionally do, and I was like I at least want to be able to do that. And so the Pacifica batteries, they're 16 kilowatts, but there's 6 modules to get to 400 volts, and each module is like barely bigger than a shoebox.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, so like and each one only weighs 30 pounds too, which is nice. So like you're not adding a huge amount of weight to the car. And, you also don't get a huge range. But so right now I have one set of Chrysler Pacifica hybrid batteries in the car. They're used, so I'm certainly not getting 16 kilowatts. Like, so my
Mm.
range is lower than I would like, but that's okay. But I have a whole nother set, and my plan is to have both packs in the car running in parallel, um, so that 400 volts and 32 kilowatts, and then also because you have the two packs in parallel, you get an even higher ability, a discharge rate. So with both packs running, I'll see less voltage sag, and just be able to step on the pedal harder for longer.
Yeah. Well, that probably, what do you think you'll get like around 100 miles range once you have both of those wired up?
I mean, if it was actually 32 kilowatt hours of usable battery, I think 100 miles would be reasonable. I think in reality, I don't discharge below 20%. I
Right.
don't charge above 95%. And even that, like 95 is kind of on the upper end. So
90.
like, yeah, in reality, I'm with both packs, I'm probably down to like 24 kilowatts. And then I'm using used modules of like unknown provenance. And so like you know, their capacity is definitely diminished. So in reality, I think I'm probably gonna be closer to like 20 or less kilowatts, which, now we're talking certainly not 100 miles, maybe 60,
Yeah.
maybe depending on how much I step on the pedal while driving,
Maybe 40.
which, I have a 30-mile commute. And in the middle of that commute, I can charge if I want. Like,
Yeah.
there is a charger available. So like it's possible. But that's a one of the downsides of using used things is you don't really know. Like you might know, like if you buy a whole car, like what the mileage of the car was in its low miles, and you can say, okay, these are probably mostly good.
Sure.
But I bought my batteries just as loose modules. I don't even know if they're all from if each set of 6 is from the same car. They could be 12 different vans that my batteries
That's
came.
true.
So I've done a bunch of work to like balance them all to make sure that they're all at a similar state of charge, and that's okay. But I don't know the current capacity of them. So
Get
uh,
breaking into those modules and balancing the cells, is that something that you knew how to do before, or have you learned as you've gone on this?
so I mean, like at a really low level, like I drove RC cars and they
Okay.
run LiPo batteries, and I balanced LiPo batteries, and so like the concepts were totally there. But you're talking like a 4S, a 4 series, battery. You plug it into a hobby charger with balanced leads, and like I understood the concept of like, okay, we're trying to make sure that each one of those 4 LiPo batteries is at the same state of charge and is fine. When you take it up to 96S to get to 400 volts, that's certainly a different beast. 4S isn't terribly dangerous. Like, sure, the pack could explode and light on fire, but like if you short it to yourself, like it's gonna hurt, but you're gonna be okay.
Yeah.
96S, like it will literally kill you. And so, like, it's a different step to say, okay, I am working with high voltage. I need to really make sure that everything is correctly, if you swap two leads, that's a big deal to the BMS. Um, and so you got to make sure that everything is perfect from there, and then just have really good practices around safety. Wear the isolating gloves. Like, make sure that there isn't just 400 volts exposed that people can touch like normally. Um,
Right.
so all of that being said, I don't actually have the BMS wired up right now. I am the human BMS.
Okay.
So uh, what I've been doing is it's a very tedious process of measuring each individual cell voltage, building up a table of cell voltages, and saying, okay, which ones. It's much easier for me to pull a cell down than it is like I could hook up a single charger and try to dump current into it, a single cell, but it's much easier to, I actually have a little fan that I connect. It's a little 4-volt fan, and so if one particular cell is higher than the others, I just hook up the fan and wait till the cell voltage drops. And then my table, it's an Excel table that I've got color coded. So if any cell is too high, it's like, oh, that's the one I got to go find and lower down. But that's just that's temporarily where I'm at. I have an actual BMS to hook up. I just haven't had the time. Um, I'm a proponent of using OEM parts, as they were built and designed to be on a car that's going to run 100,000 miles. Like, it's got to be really robust and just work.
Sure.
And so I found that the Nissan Leaf BMS is set up for a 96S battery. So, it will connect correctly to my battery. And then the control, like the CAN bus signals to send to the battery to get it to actually, balance the battery and do everything correctly, have already been decoded by someone. If you go to openinverter.org, you can find the CAN signals to send to the BMS in order for the BMS to turn on and correctly balance the battery. So that is my plan, is to wire that up and use it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, real quick though, this may be a total layman question, but what are you referring to when you say S? So the 4S,
Oh,
96S.
oh, sure. Um, so a 4S is 4 series effectively. So
Oh,
you take
okay.
a LiPo battery, or is effectively, around 3.7 volts. And so in order to get up to 400 or whatever you need, you take one battery and you hook the positive of that battery to the negative of the next battery. And so you kind of just daisy chain the batteries until you get a high enough voltage. So each one you daisy chained in series adds the voltage to the next and the next and the next. And
Got
so
it.
a 4S is 4 in series. A 4P is, rather than connecting the positive to the negative, you connect the positive to the positive. And so that will keep the voltage at the same. So if you have a 4P battery, it'll still only be 3.7 volts nominal, but then it'll have the capacity of 4 batteries. And so when I say I've got, 2 Chrysler Pacifica hybrid battery modules, I've got a 96S bank of batteries, and then I've got another 96S bank. In order to keep it at 400, which my motor uses, I will take, one whole bank and another whole bank, and I will put them in parallel together. Um, there's some nuance around whether or not, do you parallel at certain levels, or do you parallel at the ends? Um, for my use case, I think I'm going to parallel the whole packs together. You have to be careful, because if the packs have very different voltages, so if one pack is discharged and the other pack is fully charged, when you hook them up together in parallel, the one that's at 400 volts will start trying to charge the one that's at 350 volts,
They
and
want to
so those,
balance.
yeah, but those batteries are capable of sending a lot of current, and so it's actually considerably, it's kind of dangerous if you don't have those packs really well synced up to the same voltage when you hook them together. So that's part of the reason I haven't actually, put the second pack in the car, is like, it's not a trivial thing to do. I can't just throw the other pack in the car and bolt them together, hook the bus bars together and say it's good. I actually have to, like, okay, make sure they're perfectly, they're balanced correctly. I need to run really, because the 2 packs are going to be kind of far apart. One's going to be towards the back and one's going to be in the front. Um, you have to run really heavy gauge cables so that you don't have, voltage loss from the cabling between the two batteries. I'm probably going to run heavier gauge cable between the batteries than I am between the battery and the motor, just because I want no drop in voltage just from my cables.
Yeah, that makes sense. So really, really free flow between the two.
Correct.
So you'll have to uh, get another Excel table, right? One for each pack and balance it out, and then you can hook it up, and then you can add the battery management system, and it should take care of itself.
Yeah, I'm actually going to end up likely having two battery management systems because even though the packs are in parallel, you can't have the same battery management system hooked up to the both batteries, because what if one cell in one battery is low and one cell in the other battery is high? The battery management system won't be able to tell you that which one is bad. It won't be able to fix the high one by discharging it, because it would also be discharging the low one. Um,
Hmm.
so I'm going to end up having two BMSs there, which just adds to the a little bit of complication there. Which is why for now I just drive around on one set of batteries and just slightly lower discharge, slightly lower, well, significantly lower range. But
Yeah.
it's fun and it works for now.
That's interesting. I would have thought that that once they were in parallel, the battery management system might be able to balance them appropriately, and do that for you. But it still is isolated 92, 96S systems, even with the battery management system in place, which is why you
Yeah,
need two.
you have to be really careful there too, because now you've got two different systems measuring different voltages, but they're really kind of the same voltage. So you need to make sure the isolation is good between all those systems. You don't accidentally want, like, it all almost all of the communication between all of these things is CAN bus, which is like mostly isolated, but you still don't want potential at one system to be much higher than the potential of the other. So you know, running two batteries in parallel, significantly more complicated than just running one battery. But unfortunately, it's what I need to, like. I could parallel the modules and like then it's slightly safer, but it makes the building of the battery packs much more complicated. So the Pacifica batteries are actually 16S modules together, and
Okay.
so I can take each 16S module and run those in parallel, and like that might be better technically, but it makes it significantly more complicated from just packaging and building the system.
Right. And routing the wires, because you're splitting them up in the front and the back and getting them in different places, right?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's not too much worse to do that, except now, like, if you have your BMS, talking to all of them, now you have to have BMS leads from each end coming all the way across the car. So,
Yeah.
I've got 48 BMS leads in addition to your two heavy gauge cables. Whereas when I split the pack up, I can just leave the BMS for the front modules in the front, and
Hmm.
don't have to try to run those cables down the car as well.
That makes sense. So, and then but I guess the good news, Nissan Leaf BMS is probably not that expensive. So you can get two of those and it should be relatively not that painful.
Yeah, they're relatively cheap. They don't come up super frequently. It seems like most of those older Nissan Leafs are just still out driving around. Like,
That's
so
kind of cool.
yeah. So I just kind of watch eBay, and every now and then one comes up, and so I have two now that I bought
Okay.
just for options. Yeah. Um,
So
but
then, speaking of complicated systems and things like that, what about cooling? And what's your approach to that? And is that itself a pretty complicated system, or did we get lucky?
I mean, it can be a very complicated system. In order to, if you want to use the battery and motor coolant to also run your interior heating, if you want to hook up your AC compressor so that you can use AC to cool down, the EV components, that you can build a really complicated system. And like an OEM car will have a very complicated system that like works really well,
Yeah.
but I don't really need that. So I've got the motor that needs cooling. I've got the charger that needs cooling, and realistically, the batteries, like, if I were to fast charge them, they would need cooling. If I wanted to have them be at the optimal temperature for running, I might need to heat them. But for now, I'm actually not heating or cooling my batteries. The way the Chrysler Pacifica batteries work is they don't have a cooling loop inside them. They have
Okay.
a plate that the cooling loop runs inside the plate, and it's just kind of sandwiched against the battery. And so ultimately, I can go back and add a plate in for cooling if I want to. Someday, I'll probably want fast charging.
Yeah.
I can add that in and do it. But for now, I just have a really small coolant loop with the motor and the charger on it, just to try to keep those two things cool. The motor makes a lot of heat, but it's actually quite manageable just with a passive radiator, at least for the use cases I'm doing. If I end up like trying to take it to a track day, my little radiator probably won't be sufficient. I'm not using the NSX radiator. The radiator was in the front with giant aluminum tubes running to the back for where the motor was, and so I just pulled all of that out. And I've got a little radiator in the back of the car, just underneath the trunk. Um, it's small,
Oh, okay.
because you
Simple.
know, well, I mean, the NSX radiator is trying to cool down an ice motor, and an ice motor is not necessarily terribly efficient when it comes to heat.
Hmm.
A lot of energy is wasted generating heat, which then has to be put out through the radiator, whereas the EV is very efficient compared to an ice motor when it comes to heat. And so I don't need that full size automotive radiator anymore. A smaller radiator keeps the temperatures perfectly fine for everything I've been doing so far. And I've just got a little electric water pump, an OEM Bosch water pump, that I've got set up. And basically, anytime the car is on, I just run the pump because I'm not I'm not cooling the batteries, so I'm not worried about overcooling the batteries. And so keeping the motor cool is all that it needs to do. And so as long as it's running, uh, as long as the car is on, the pump is running, and the motor will be kept cool. Uh, and then the same with the charger. I've got a 10 kilowatt Model S charger in the car. 10
Okay.
kilowatts, a fair amount, and that thing actually generates some heat too. And so that's just in the coolant loop. And if it's parked and charging, the pump is also running and cooling that. I could make the system more complicated. I could put a couple three-way valves in and not cool the charger while I'm driving the car, but in reality, it just kind of adds some thermal mass. It doesn't, a little thermal mass, a little restriction. It's not hurting the ability of the car to cool because I'm not charging and driving at the same time.
Right. Well, I like that. It's elegant, it's simple, and it's not it's not over engineered for what you're trying to do.
Exactly. Yep. Just trying to, at this point, just every little step to make the car more drivable is where I'm going. Yeah. So for a long time, I didn't even have an onboard charger. I was, charging the modules by hand, which was very painful and slow. And only in the past, I guess it's been like a month or two, I got the onboard charger plumbed in and wired up and working. And I've been out to a couple public charging stations and plugged in, and it's been a lot of fun to just be able to like roll up and plug my car in and be like, "Yep, here we go. I'm free juice or
It's
cheap juice."
working.
Yes. It also makes me much more confident to go drive the car somewhere. When I had a low kilowatt pack and no onboard charger, I was like really, really range anxiety, paranoid whenever I drove the car. But now that I know I can just, any J1772, like, level one or level two charger will work just fine for the car. And, they're getting less common. I feel like CCS and CHEDEMO like are becoming the much more common like public charging infrastructure, but there are still
Yeah.
plenty of level one and level two chargers, out there. I've got like all the different like charging apps on my phone, so I can just like, okay, which one? Where am I?
Just do a quick search. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So, other than charging it, there's as you're driving it more and more, what has the process been like using open inverter and dialing in, making that motor behave? And I imagine that there's a process similar to any tuning, but instead of air fuel ratios, you're dealing with voltage and flow and how that is interfacing with the throttle and all or the accelerator and all of that stuff. What's that been like?
That has been fairly complicated. if I were to suggest someone to build an EV, I would like as their first thing, I would probably not tell them to go use an open inverter board. I would tell them to, either use an off-the-shelf system like a Hyper 9 or something, or spoof the OE cars system such that you just need to send it throttle signals and it drives.
Okay.
That it just there's a really steep learning curve. In
Mm.
fact, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with Megasquirt, but this is another semi-open source, computer made for ICE vehicles. And so I had done this already for my Miata with a turbo, and that learning curve was really steep. It's not just air fuel; it's coolant enrichment and all of the other parameters involved in actually making the car drive really smoothly all the time. So the
Yeah.
open board, when they send it to you, it will drive the motor for sure, but there are so many parameters that you really need to actually adjust for your particular motor and your particular batteries in order
Mm.
to get the most, not only the most power out of the motor, but also the most drivability. So like for the first 2 or 3 months that I drove the car, I was running on an older version of the firmware. It was just the firmware that shipped on the PCB when they sent it to me. And they tested it, they shipped it to me. I assumed it was good. Uh, it like the car had some stutter like at low throttle, and it wouldn't really pull above 80 kilowatts like no matter what I did, and it would actually hit overcurrent. Like it would do 80 kilowatts and then it would hit an overcurrent limit, and I'm like, this should not be overcurrenting. I know that I'm not hitting those limits.
Right.
And so I did a bunch of reading, and people in the open inverter forum were like 520, which is, so I was on 5.13, which was what they sent on it, and people were like 520 is really great. It made my car so much better. It's like, well, I was a little hesitant because if you update the firmware on the board, like if you do it wrong, you could brick the board, or like it might not work, and then you have to like take the motor out, take the can off, take the board out, and like you can recover it, but it's not a trivial thing to do. So I was hesitant, and in the end, I was like, you know what, I just need to do it. And so I updated it to 520. I loaded my original parameters back on that I had, like, I had tweaked some things to try to make it drive better, and the car drives beautifully. Um, so just parameters that aren't even like, there are the parameters that you need to tune, but then there's also just like the control loops and everything that's in the background. And
Mm.
those parts, like, it is open source, like I can go see what they've done. But in order to truly understand what is going on there, you really need to have a good grasp of like a brushless DC motor controller control loop. And like this is not a simple thing. So I've studied it a bunch to try to get a better idea, which has helped me understand how to adjust the parameters. But like, I definitely am not going to be going in and adjusting the firmware level things myself
Yeah.
soon. And so like all of that combined is why I would like it's working very well for me. I'm able to, I'm spinning the motor in reverse at, I've pulled much higher than 80 kilowatts now. And the car drives very well. There's no more like off throttle or like low throttle stuttering. But it was a lot of work to get to that point and a lot of understanding required. And if you just want to build a car and go drive it, like, understanding all of that and figuring out all of that's probably not really where you're at. If you want like your drop-in LS with your, painless wiring harness and your off-the-shelf tune, that's not what the open inverter system is. This is the mega squirt. Like every single parameter is adjustable to you, and you got to learn what they are, or it's not going to work. Or it's not
Yeah.
going to work at all. Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I actually remember Mega Squirt from back in the day. I had an Eclipse, and some people were using Mega Squirt on those. I never did, but I had a sense of the complexity. So I think that's a really good comparison. Makes sense.
Yep. Yeah. So I'm now at the point where the car drives pretty well. I take it to work once or twice a week, have fun with it. There's still a mountain of things to do with it, but I'm really enjoying being at this point where it's just a car that I can drive. And
Yeah,
there's a lot of work to get there, but it's been so much fun now.
it's paid off.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, that's a good place to be. Project cars and passion cars like this. I there's always something, I think, refinement, and with EV stuff that's changing so quickly. you know, who knows? In 5 years, there may be a better option than the Pacifica batteries that have similar characteristics. And then it's like, well, shoot, what are we going to do? So it'll be really exciting to see how this evolves and where you take it over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited for advances in batteries and everything else. I have looked at the front spindles to try to figure out, like, can I put a front motor in this car and get drive shafts? And it's gonna be a lot of work, and I don't know that I'll do it now, but it's definitely something I'm like noodling on. And like, you know, that motor that would be in the front would take the space where the batteries were. So some other battery solution would have to come in order for that to really be a thing that I was able to do. But
Have to put them in the floor.
Probably have to lift the car up then. I barely fit, I'm 6'3", and like my head is like touching the roof of the car with the seat all the way down. So the floor is a challenge in the NSX.
Yeah, yeah, but they are absolutely gorgeous. I don't know. I'm waiting for the official announcement on Holly as well, but I'm hoping to go. So uh look forward to seeing you there. If it all works out in schedules.
Absolutely. I'd love to see you there. I think, that it was my goal to get the car driving for it last year. And like, I didn't really make it, but I had so much fun talking to all the people that are there, you know, not just the vendors, but there are so many people who brought amazing conversions, but then even just like, modified Teslas, modified OEM EVs that I was just like, it's a really cool scene. And I think it's amazing that Holly is putting on this event, even though like, I'm not using any AEM parts, I'm not using any Holly parts, but they're still happy to have me there as well. And so I think it's great that to have that community and, face-to-face interaction available. I follow a lot of people on Instagram to like watch their builds and stuff. And but meeting them in person and being able to see the car, like it's so much different.
Yeah, it is a really cool scene. There's excitement and a lot of new people getting into it, a lot of established folks that are really like they have a new energy because it's a problem and a brand new uh, frontier to figure out and be creative with. So yeah, I'm loving it as well. And everyone's super nice, so that makes it a big bonus.
Yep. I actually had a guy on. I have a custom dash in the car that I built up. It's a Raspberry Pi. Talks CAN bus to the motor, shows things, and like
Sweet.
it runs a web page. And that web page, I just like put a HTML table in there to show some parameters and just make it work, so I can see what's going on. Because otherwise, I was driving the car blind. It was not great. I didn't actually get battery voltage until I stopped and checked the battery voltage. And so I got this working, and I posted a video on Instagram. Like, here it is. Like, look, it's working. It shows stuff. And uh, a guy out of the blue, I have zero idea. I literally don't even know the guy's name. I know his Instagram handle.
Yeah.
Contacted me and was like, I think your project is really cool. I'm a web dev. And so I shared my GitHub of like what I did. And, a few weeks later, he's like, here, try this code. And now I have this beautiful dash that like, it's got a bar graph where the amperage is, it shows miles per hour. Like,
Wow.
he just did this because he thinks the project is cool and wanted to be able to contribute to it. And I'm like, that's amazing. Like, I don't know where else I would get that kind of interaction than a community like this where people are excited about, just building cool things.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, thank you for carving out the time once again. This was really fun, and we'll talk to you here soon.
Sounds great. It's been really fun, Dan.